Hi everyone, it's Mary from Joyful and Mary Quilting. I'm excited to share with you a quick and easy tutorial to create this buzzsaw quilt block. You just use 4 squares of fabric and 4 strips. That's it. This versatile block offers endless possibilities, which I love. It can be scrappy, it can be monochromatic like this, or it can feature a 2-color design like this. Whether you're an experienced quilter, a beginner, this pattern is perfect for unleashing your creativity and really adding a dynamic twist to your quilting projects. And there's a free PDF that goes with this tutorial that walks you through the entire process step by step. So let's gather our fabrics and let's get started. So let's talk about what we need in order to create this block. If you're making it from scraps, you can use scraps of 1 color for each buzzsaw. If you're making it from 2 different contrasting fabric squares and your background, just pick 2. It can be the same fabric color or it can be 2 different colors, or you can just do it all with the same fabric, and that's what I'm going to show you here. So first of all, in the instructions, it lists the materials needed. And again, this is going to be for 1 block that you create using just 2 fabrics, a contrasting fabric and a background fabric. Super easy. You'll need from your background fabric 2 7-inch by 7-inch squares, and then from your contrasting fabric you'll need 2 7-inch by 7-inch squares. You're also going to need 4 2.5 by 6.5 inch strips of that contrasting fabric. These, keep in mind, are oversized. They're going to help us trim our block back, our quadrants back, so that we have nice even blocks. So we'll start, if you follow along with the directions, it's just a 3-page handout. It's super easy, but there's a couple of little tips and tricks in here that I want to show you that's going to help you as you're assembling the block. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is, I'm going to show you, this is what you will need for doing the buzzsaw block out of 2 fabrics. I used this red for my contrasting fabric and I used this white for my background fabric. So I have 2 7-inch squares from the white background fabric and 2 7-inch squares from the contrasting fabric. In addition, you need 4 strips, and here's the 4 contrasting fabric strips, 2.5 by 6.5 inches. Again, they're slightly oversized because the finished half square triangle we'll be making at the beginning is only 6 inches. So let's set these aside. Now I'm just going to quickly show you if you would like to do this using 2 different fabrics. So you will basically make a block that's similar to this one right here. I have used 2 different fabrics, and as you make your half square triangles, it's going to flow together. If you take a look at the example, you just want to make sure that you have everything lined up so that it alternates as you go around the buzzsaw. What I used for that is, my background fabric is the same. I just have that white background fabric, but then I only need 1 7-inch square of fabric A and 1 7-inch square of fabric B. Then I will also need 2 strips and 2 strips of fabric A and fabric B. So that's the only difference that we have here. If you're going to scrappy it up a little bit, then what you'll want to do is make sure that you have the contrasting fabric squares cut as I've shown here. If you're doing a whole quilt and you want to make contrasting blocks all throughout the quilt, then all you have to do is just keep cutting those 7-inch squares, however many you need. Just keep in mind that for each block, you will need 2 7-inch squares of contrasting fabric. So let's go ahead and take a look. We're going to set these strips aside. We're not ready for those yet. But we're going to take a look at our pattern. And the first thing we're going to do is create 4 6-inch by 6-inch half square triangles for 1 buzzsaw quilt block. Once again, if you're scrapping it up, the more you make, the more pieces you'll have to pick from. We're just going to do it with 2 different fabrics, and then you can have each buzzsaw be a different color, which is really fun also. So let's make those half square triangles first. Take your 2 background fabric squares wrong side up, and we're going to draw our cutting and our sewing lines. I like to use my 2.5-inch ruler. I also like to line up my points of my square on a line on my mat. It just gives me a little extra check when I'm placing my ruler and drawing my lines. So I've got my ruler, I'm going to draw a line here. That will be my cutting line. Then I'm going to place the 1/4 inch marking of my ruler directly on that center corner to corner line, and I'm going to draw another line. Then I'm going to flip it around and do the same thing, placing my 1/4 inch marking of my ruler right on that diagonal corner to corner line, and I'm going to draw a line on the other side. These two outside lines are my sewing lines. You'll do it on this square and on this square. Now also keep in mind that when you're doing this, these half square triangles that we are making need to be 6 inches by 6 inches. They're going to be a little bigger. That's why I love the go big and cut back method, or trim back, because it always gives me an accurate measurement in the end, whether I'm doing half square triangles, whether I'm doing flying geese, whatever it is that I'm doing, square and a square, it always allows me to trim back and get that accurate sizing. All right, the next thing we'll do is we're going to place these two squares, the contrasting square and the background square, right sides together with the marked side of my contrasting fabric facing up. Then I'm just going to put a couple of pins in here to stabilize. We just don't want it to shift because this is a large square. So we're going to do that to both of these. I'm going to take this one as well, and I am going to line everything up. You want all those raw edges lined up. Again, we're going to trim back. So if maybe your cutting is just a teeny tiny bit off, like you can see here, it's not going to matter. Now, we are going to take both of these to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew on, not on the middle line. We're going to sew on those outside lines. You can either chain piece these, or you can sew this one, flip it, sew it, and then do this one. It's totally up to you. The end product that we want to have a seam here, a seam here, a seam here, and a seam here. So go ahead and sew those seams together. So I have done that. I've sewn on each one of those marked lines. Now I'm going to take my rotary cutter and I'm going to cut it on the cutting line, which is the diagonal corner to corner line. Line everything up on the cutting mat just to make sure that we have a nice straight line. It can get off easily and we just don't even notice it. We just want to make sure that we have a nice 1/4 inch seam on each side of that diagonal line. So we've cut these two in half, and then we're going to do the same thing. Now we're ending up with 4 half square triangles doing this process, and that's what we need. Now, once again, if you're using scrappy or whatever, you can switch these around. You can cut 4 at one time and then, have different fabrics in here. If you're doing 2, you can do 2, totally up to you, but I'm showing you with 1 just so you get the process. Then you can figure out your own design. So the next thing we want to do is we want to put some pressing solution on the seam, because that's what's going to flatten out our half square triangles. And it's important, as you can see in the block, because we have lots of bulk in various areas on this block, and the more we can flatten our seams out, the better off we'll be in the end. I find that using the pressing marker, it's just an empty pressing marker, the link is in the description. I filled it with my pressing solution, Mary Ellen's Best Press, a diluted Terreal Magic, half and half Terreal Magic, half water, whatever you want to use works well here. And then we are going to press it toward that darker fabric. So I'll bring my pressing mat over, and then I'm going to do that pressing. And you want to just press until this is dry. You don't want to scorch your fabric. You want to be careful. It's a good idea to just place your iron and leave it there, 8-10 seconds, something like that. Check it. It's dry. Do the next one. Same thing. I like to push it because we are pressing it toward the darker fabric, so just pushing it over gets it a nice, smooth, even line. And then you can see that's good. Our pressing solution is dry. If it's saturated too much, you don't want to do that either. That's why I like the pressing marker, just because it puts just enough in there that it doesn't soak it, but it gives it enough flatness in the seam that it doesn't overcome the entire block. I always like to press all of my fabrics with pressing solution before I cut anything. So we always have pressing solution in this, but this just gives us a little extra, and you can see how flat that seam is, which is what we're going for. And here's the last one. Looks like my solution didn't go all the way across, so we'll just do it again. And again, these pressing markers I love because they don't give you too much. They give you just enough solution right where it needs to go. So it's just a favorite of mine. I just don't do any seams without it any longer. So there we go. Now we have those 4 beautiful blocks all nice and pressed. We want to trim them down to a 6-inch block, not 6.5. We want it to be 6 inches. I like to use my block lock ruler. I have a 6.5-inch block lock ruler, but you don't have to. You can use any ruler. You can use a 6.5-inch ruler if you want. Place it on the diagonal. There's a diagonal always marked on these rulers, so you can see I've got my 45-degree diagonal marked. And I will make sure that I have everything lined up right along this line. And then I'm going to trim off the extra. Now remember, this is a 6-inch. We want to make sure that it's a 6-inch block. My ruler is 6.5. So I like to make sure I've got a little extra around the edge. And then here's my 6-inch mark, and I can see there's extra here as well. So I am good to cut. So I'm going to show you this one without the block lock. This is just using your regular ruler. I do have a tutorial on how to make a do-it-yourself ruler where you place tape along your diagonal line, and that gives you a little ridge similar to what the block lock ruler does. Not exactly the same, but it works in a pinch. And if you want to take a look at that, you can. So here I've got this lined up one more time. I checked and double checked before I cut. My 6 inches here, and then I am going to trim that off. Now I've got the 6-inch block that I need. So I showed you how to trim your half square triangle to 6 inches just using a plain ruler and that 45-degree angle on your ruler. Now, the block lock ruler is my favorite just because it stays in place no matter what. It also has a diagonal line, but it has a groove in there that is actually going to line up next to your seam allowance when it's been pressed in this direction. So I've lined, I can feel it. It locks, that's why it's block lock. It's locked in place, and I want to make sure that I have 6 inches everywhere around the edge. Now, this is a 6.5-inch ruler, so I've got extra here and here that will be trimmed off, and extra here and here that will be trimmed off. So when I do it, again, this is why I love this ruler, it does not move. It stays in place until I get everything trimmed. Then you can just flip it around or do it this way. Line up my 6 and my 6, line up my diagonal. Remember, it pushes right in place, so everything is good to go. I want to make sure that my lines, and I love this ruler too because the lines are so thin that I know for sure I've got my piece lined up accurately. And then I'm going to trim here and trim here, and then go ahead and cut just like we did before. I'm going to do that to all 4 of my blocks. Now it's time to cut our strips for our buzzsaw. What you want to make sure before you do anything is that the contrasting fabric is in the lower left corner of your half square triangle. This is essential. If you don't, if you put this fabric in it, your buzzsaw is going to go in the opposite direction. That's not a problem. It is a problem though if you cut 2 one way and 2 the other way. Then your buzzsaw is not going to look like a buzzsaw. So I've got this positioned where I need it to go. I'm going to make sure that I have markings on my cutting mat that help me line everything up. And then I'm going to cut 4 1.5-inch strips from this 6-inch block. So I've lined up my, right here you can see I've got that bottom, just any line on your ruler will work. I like my 2.5-inch by 12.5-inch ruler. You line that up just to keep everything straight, and then the left side is going to be 1.5 inches. check and double check. Make sure you don't cut it wrong because there's no wiggle room here. So we want to make sure, if you watched my video on how to create the perfect quilt block every time, it shows you how to cut. You want to make sure that you have the line on your ruler on top of your fabric, but you don't want fabric showing on this side. You don't want cutting mat showing on this side. You want it to be right along the edge. That's what's going to give you an accurate cut. Now you may think, well, that's nothing, it doesn't matter. But it does matter in the end. It helps to make everything a little bit more aligned. So we're going to cut our first strip here. Then we're going to cut our second strip, same process. And there we go, everything's lined up. 2, and then our last 2 strips, 1.5. Everything is lined up. And then our last strip is perfect. Look at that. Okay, so now that we have these cut, you will do this for all 4 of your half square triangles. But I like to do them one at a time just because I don't want to mix everything up. I want to make sure that everything is in order. Now, let's say that you're doing a scrappy quilt and you've cut a bunch of these strips. Go ahead and pull one that looks like this, a different fabric that looks like this, a different fabric that looks like this, and a different one that looks like this. You can do so much with this block. It's really fun. If you're doing that, keep everything organized according to what the strip looks like. And then as you have that, I like to use my design board and stack everything up like pieces in one spot. That way when I pull them off, I know I've picked the right one. So now that we've cut these strips for the first quadrant, we're going to flip them. So if you take a look at the pattern on page 2, this is what we have right now. We have everything just cut, but we haven't moved them yet. Now what we want it to do is look like this. So we're just going to take this piece, and this is now going to become number 1. Number 3 is going to become number 2. Number 2 is going to become number 3. And then our first one is going to be moved to the end. Now we have the buzzsaw look. So this is where we are going with this. We've got always our contrasting fabric. The teeny one is going to go down in this corner, and the background fabric, the smallest, is going to go up in the top right corner. We're going to sew these pieces together. I like to sew them together. 2, press the seam open, 2, press the seam open, and then I'm going to add at the very end, I will add this piece to this side, but not yet. So we're going to go ahead and sew these together. Make sure that you pin these. Make sure when you put these together that everything is lined up. You don't want one hanging off the end. They are cut accurately, and that means that we want to make sure that everything is lined up. That's why I pin everything. So I'm going to pin this one. You can pin 1, 2, 3 pins, whatever you want. 3 is probably enough. Usually I like 3 because I end up pulling that one out right away when I put it under the machine, and I still want to have a little bit of an anchor right there. Then I'm going to do the same thing here. Keep track of which side you're sewing. You want to make sure that you pin that immediately so that you don't go by accident and sew the wrong side. You're going to end up ripping out. So I've got these nicely pinned, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch here, a 1/4 inch here, and press these seams open. So I've done that. Remember, we want the contrasting fabric, the little one in the corner. So we're going to sew this piece to this piece, and in the end, once we've sewn these two together, we will add this extra piece here. So again, pin it right now, fold it over, and you just want to make sure that you've got everything lined up. And then we'll pin here, we'll pin here. And I like my little teeny clover extra fine pins because they don't get in the way. I don't sew over them, but they let me sew almost right up to the pin, and they're flat. It's pretty flat right here. So you're going to sew along this edge a 1/4 inch seam and press this seam open. Once you do that, you're going to center this piece on this side. You can pin that now if you want. It's not going to get in the way. And that way, when you sew that, you've got a little bit of fabric on each end to trim off. So you know that if everything is just a teeny bit off, you can fix it. So here I'm putting this in. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to sew this 1/4 inch seam and sew this 1/4 inch seam. Once again, press all those seams open. And there we've done that. Doesn't that look pretty? It's so beautiful. Now remember, this is a 6-inch block. It's not 6.5. You know, we could do 6.5, but there's just too much math involved in that. 6 we know is divisible. We can go ahead and the 1.5 is an easy cut. Now what we want to do is we are going to actually line this up, and the only sides we're going to trim will be the top, the bottom, and the right side of this big piece. These will not be trimmed. That's how we know how to line up our ruler. So we've got the 6-inch marking of our ruler right there and right here. That's where it needs to go. And you know, we can only do 2 sides at one time. So we've got this lined up. Make sure everything is straight. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to trim off this side. And I'm going to trim off the top. Okay. Flip it around. I've only got one little part left to trim, and that's going to be the finish of our 6-inch quadrant. And there we go. And we have completed 1 quadrant of our block. So if we take a look in the directions, it shows where we're going to trim this off. This has already been pressed open. We only trim the top, the bottom, and the side. We don't trim here because this should be perfect. That's going to give us what I have just created. You need 4 of these quadrants. Now, once again, this is where you can do something fun. You can actually put different colors in those 4 quadrants going around. You can do what I did in this block, where I flipped it so that I actually took pieces from the lighter fabric and pieces from the darker fabric and intermingled them. It's just, you know, a fun block with so much versatility. Okay, so now the next thing we're going to do is we are going to put these quadrants together. This is really important. You want to make sure that you follow along in the instructions so that you've lined everything up so it looks like a buzzsaw. You don't want one that's flipped the wrong direction. Keep in mind that this large strip is always going to be in the middle. So once we put it together, just flip it where it goes, and those strips need to always be in the middle. So I know when we start out, we want the buzzsaw here, we want the background fabric here, and the next piece that we add, here's the middle, that's the piece when we've turned it. So we're going to sew these 2 pieces together, and then we'll do the same to the bottom. We're going to sew these pieces together. Now take a look. Here's my inside large strip, my inside strip, my inside strip, my inside strip. My corners are all background fabric. The buzzsaw looks like this. If you've got something going on like this, you can make a really unique and fun pattern out of it. I mean, you can do so many things with this particular pattern to make it look fun in a big quilt. It's up to you, but to make the buzzsaw, this is the way you want it to go. So we are going to put these together. Now, this is something, there's only 1 point on each quadrant that you're going to want to match, and that's this one. You don't want to cut that point off here. You don't want to cut that point off there. That's where I use my pencil to make sure I preserve my point. Now, keep everything organized because you don't want to sew the wrong pieces together, but you do want to mark that point. So I like to take my pin, and this is just a magic pin, just a slightly larger one than my extra fine clover pin, and I put it in here, right in the point. So you're going to make sure that it goes perpendicular down. You don't want it this way because it's not going to show up in the right spot on the back. So you, as best as you can, you want that straight up and down. Turn it over, and then you're going to turn this pin horizontally like this, so that it's kind of a line for you. You're going to take your pencil, and you can use, just a regular old mechanical pencil, or you can use, I've got my sew line that I love because it has different colors depending on the fabric I'm using. And I'm going to take and I'm going to make a teeny mark right under the side closest to the raw edge, right under my pin. This is what you will sew through. You're going to sew through that. You're not going to sew above it. You're not going to sew below it. You're going to sew through it. So let's go ahead and take a look. We want to put these two together. So we put them right sides together, match everything up along the edge. If you start going a little crooked like this, your block is going to look crooked. So it's important that everything matches. And then we are going to, I'm going to just use my small pins. I'm going to put 3 in here because I want to make sure that I've got enough, but I don't want to have so much traffic on this side that I can't get my sewing machine to plow through it. So we're going to sew that 1/4 inch seam right along this edge. So I've sewn that together. My point is perfect. I have pressed my seam open, and I've done that to quadrants 1 and 2. Now I have to do the same thing here with 3 and 4. And you can see my point is perfect. That's because I made that little mark. So worth it to do that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to press this seam open, and I want to show you what I use. Now you can just go ahead if you want, and just on your pressing surface, you're going to take this. I like to put my pressing solution on here. I just do it right on the seam. That way I know it's going right where it needs to go. And then you can open it up, use your finger, and press it open. What I find happens when I do it this way is sometimes my seam can get a little skewed. I have to just be really careful. So I came across this tool, and I'm not affiliated with the company in any way. I just like the tool. It's actually by You and Me. I bought mine at Fat Quarter Shop. This is a clapper on the bottom, and then we have this wool pressing mat right here that's rounded. And the thing is, when I place this on here just like this, it just lays so much flatter and it doesn't go crooked on me. So that when I take my iron and I press along that edge, hold it till it's dry, you can see then when I place it on my pressing mat to give it the final press, it just comes out beautifully. Just perfect. Now the last thing we're going to do with our buzzsaw is we're going to put the 2 pieces together. So we're going to do the same thing we did here. We have 2 more points that we need to preserve. We're going to do that. I'm going to put my pin in right in there. I'm going to mark it. I like to point it in the direction of the lighter fabric. It's just easier to see. And there I'm going to sew through that, remember? And then same thing on this side. Now, there's an issue here, and I'm going to show you that in just a second. So I poked it right in the point, I've turned it sideways, and I am going to mark, as I've done here, right there on the side closest to the edge. Okay, we want to make sure that we do that, but here's the issue. When we put right sides together, we can see this one, we can't see that one. So what we're going to do is, the first thing is I want to match up my center seams. The way I do that, I use my Tiny Clover fine pins. I'm going to put the pin right through that seam that's pressed open, and then through the seam here that's pressed open. And I'm going to diagonally pin across the seam. And this is in my workshop also, how to create the perfect quilt block every time, how to pin those intersections so that everything lines up. I'll remove that pin. Now, this one's easy. Right here, you can see I'm going to sew right through that line. So I've pinned it. I'm just going to pin it on the side. You don't have to pin right in there. And I'm pinning it here. So what do I do over here? Well, I make sure that it's lined up. We want everything lined up. And then I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to poke all the way through, turn my pin sideways, mark underneath it, and sew through that mark. That's what's so important, but you want to make sure that you don't move this. So I'm not going to remove the pin yet. I'm just going to do a little diagonal pin right on each side of that to hold that in place, and then I'm going to remove it. It's just so much easier. You're taking a chance when you just sew, and some people do, and it works out. But if you want to make sure it's going to work out, you're going to want to do it this way. Now sew that 1/4 inch seam, and we're going to sew through those pencil marks. So I've done my sewing. Let's check. And yay, everything works out. Once again, we are going to press these seams. Now, what I prefer on this seam right here, rather than pressing the entire seam open, what I like to do, since we have so many intersections here, And we don't want to just have to worry about pushing them back on themselves. We can spin the center seam, sort of. So what we'll want to do, this seam is anchored across here, but we want to make sure that we've got that last little stitch released right before we get to that anchor seam that's going horizontally. And then what we're going to do is we want to press toward those single strips so that these don't have to be bent in any way. And this is all we do. We just fold it back, press and press. I use my pressing solution all the way along the edge, especially right there. And then I'm going to press. So let me do that. And there we have our Buzzsaw quilt block. It's so easy, it's so fun, and swap out the fabrics. Cut several half square triangles and then put different pieces in your Buzzsaw. You can do 2 fabrics like I did here, and now you have a totally different look. You can do all blues, you can do a rainbow color, you can do whatever you want and still get this great looking block that's so versatile, goes together quickly, and works really, really well with scraps. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Be sure to like and subscribe below if you're interested in more videos where I talk about all sorts of quilting topics. I'm always trying to be joyful, but I will always be merry. Thank you for watching.